I'm Zibby Owens, and you're listening to the award-winning podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Please sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com for updates on podcast guests and lots of live events. Today's episode has been sponsored by Tink. Lauren Passell and her innovative PR company, Tink, are book-obsessed and podcast-obsessed. Tink specializes in getting authors on podcast tours. Forbes called it the, quote, the first podcast PR company for authors. This is like the coolest idea, I have to say. Podcasting is a new wild world, and pitching to podcasters like me, I guess, is an art. So Tink specializes in setting authors up for success. To learn more, you can visit tinkmedia.com or subscribe to Lauren's podcast newsletter at podcastthenewsletter.com. So definitely check out Lauren. She's amazing. And for any authors out there, you should definitely check her out for getting your book onto fantastic podcasts like this one and so many other book podcasts out there, and all types of podcasts. I'm here today with Jenny Lee, who's the author of YA novel Anna K, A Love Story, a modern-day adaptation of Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. She is a TV writer and producer who has worked on BET's Boomerang, IFC's Brookmire, Freeform's Young and Hungry, and the Disney Channel's #1 rated kids show, Shake It Up. HBO Max acquired the rights for Anna K, which Jenny Lee will adapt for the screen and write. Jenny has written 4 humorous essay collections, including I Do, I Did, Now What, Life After the Wedding Dress from 2004, which I read right before I got married the first time, and a middle grade novel series, Elvis and the Underdogs. Originally from Tennessee, Jenny lived in New York City in her 20s and currently lives in Los Angeles with her husband. Welcome, Jenny. Thanks for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Jenny is being very kind because she came a few minutes early and I had just gotten back from a run, which I do once a month, once every 2 months. My face is like purple at this point and I'm still could not get cool enough to shower. So anyway, Jenny's being very, very kind. So let's just say that. Anyway, please tell listeners what Anna K, A Love Story is about.
Anna K is a novel that is a reimagining of one of my favorite books, which is Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. So I took the same sort of plot structure, but I moved it to modern day using New York City and Greenwich, Connecticut instead of Moscow and St. Petersburg.
It's awesome. Yeah. It's like a YA Gossip Girl meets something.
Yeah, Crazy Rich Asians.
Crazy
yes.
Rich Asians. Yeah, I love that. So you have your whole line already set up. You didn't need me. You had this great letter at the end of the book, which explains when you thought of this idea, how it became, why you did it now. Can you sort of summarize that?
Sure. In 2012, I was in New York City for Christmas with my mom, and the Joe Wright version adaptation of Anna Karenina came out with Keira Knightley as the star. And we went to see it at the Ziegfeld. It's so sad it's closing. We went to see it and we had this like magical time. And my mom had read the book in Korean and in English. And I had read the book twice by then. And we were talking about it. We had this great discussion about it and how tragic it was for the ending of Anna. And then I just kept thinking what it would be like in modern day. And then later that night, I couldn't sleep and I snuck down to the lobby of the hotel. And I just was like, oh my God, Anna Karenina is a book about major time that you're in love. And I was like, oh, if you wanted to translate that to modern day, it needed to be teenagers now, because obviously in the late 1800s in Russian society, they were all in their 20s and 30s. But now it's the first time you usually fall in love is when you're a teenager.
Did you fall in love for the first time as a teenager?
Probably. I mean, whether it's now, as I'm definitely not a teenager, I've seen, you're like, oh, that was like that young first crazy teenage love. But I definitely have had that experience a couple times, like in my now second husband. When we fell in love recently, 5 years ago, I was like, oh, this is like that teenage version of love where you're super obsessed and you're smelling his shirts.
Oh, that's so cute.
And it reminded me of that. So it was really that was definitely part of the inspiration of writing this book.
And you had this line at the end that made me cry that was you can't write a true love story until you're really in love. So that's why you waited so long to write it.
Yes.
Even though you thought of it a long time ago.
Yeah. I definitely was channeling that because I was like, oh, this is the right time to do this, because it was so there's so much of my husband and our love story in this tiny little details and shout outs of things that happened between us that I kind of added as a little a gift that I gave him is in there, etc.
Trying to remember which gift that would be.
This is where Anna's brother keeps his drugs, that orange, there was an orange and an Anya Hindemark thing that I had engraved for him for an anniversary. And so I put that in there.
That store also just went out of business.
Yeah.
Anyway,
did
in
it?
New York, yeah. Anyway. So you have written for a long time. Your first book, start talking about your whole writing career.
My first book was in 2001, and it was a collection of essays, humor essays basically, called I Do, I Did, Now What? So I wrote 3 collections of humor essays in my early 30s. And none of those books, they all sold so, but none of them kind of broke out and became like a big success. And I was really using my personal life, whatever I was obsessed with at the time. And then I would tend to write a book about it. But I hadn't written fiction yet because like writing a novel, my first novel was like always like the big goal in my, ever since I was like a kid, I was like, oh my God, I want to write a book, a novel, the great American novel, etc. And then I just was like kept waiting because I was like, I need more life experience. I need more time. And then my first novel actually was a kid's book called Elvis and the Underdogs that I wrote, maybe 6 years ago when I was working on Shake It Up, a Disney Channel show. And that book started as a TV show, that it was a pitch for a TV show about a talking dog. Because it was like right when they were developing Dog with a Blog, that show. Mm-hmm, yes. They were like, oh, we're looking for outside pitches. And then I came up with the idea and I pitched it. And they were like, oh, we don't really talk about these underdog kids. It's Disney Channel. We want good looking aspirational kids. And I was like, really? Because there are many more of these underdog kids, because it's about a kid with a talking therapy dog who was always sickly. And I was like, I think there are more of these kids. And they're like, yeah, not for us. So I was like, okay. But then I was like, oh, it's such a weird idea to have this idea and come up with all these characters that you love and put it in a drawer somewhere. So then I was like, I've never written a kid's book before. And I was like, I think I'm going to just try it. Why not? So I was getting up like at 5:30 in the morning and writing 10 pages a day before work to get that novel done. And then I finished it. And yeah, that was a really gratifying experience. Like the way kids love the books they read really like strikes a chord in me because I was like that as a kid. So it was a really great experience. And having, going on tour to schools and like meeting a bunch of kids who read it was really fun for me.
Go back to the writing 10 pages before work.
Okay.
So you were working on the shows.
On the show, yeah.
And then you would get up and just write a little bit and then shut down the computer and leave. And that was it. And you would just get it out of your head. And you could just start just like that. Like, this is my time. I'm going to just whip it out.
Yes. Well, I think what it is with me in terms of prose, like TV writing's usually like in a room, especially I've only worked on comedy shows right now. And it's like a group of comedy writers, and a lot of it's done in the room. So it's like a group experience. But writing a book, it's like your own chance, your own imagination, and you have so much freedom. So I found it kind of like freeing, basically. That was also this great year when I had just gotten out of a relationship, and I was like, I'm going to take a year off of men and relationships and really focus on my career, because it just wasn't exactly where I wanted it to be. So I was like, if I took that out of the equation and didn't have to like worry what I look like when I went to the grocery store, like if I wanted to meet someone or dating, I think I'd have so much extra free time, basically. And I will say, besides this past year, that was the most productive year of my career, because I really it freed up so much space in my life to like if you're like not thinking about like relationships or this and that, and I just put it all into my work. I did that. I wrote a pilot. I wrote a lot of stuff while working on a show. But the show, I will say, Disney Channel show, that Shake It Up, we had perfect hours. It was like 10 to 6. So it wasn't like these crazy TV hours that I've had on other jobs.
But I was so sure you were going to say that then I met my husband when I swore off men.
No.
No.
I didn't. I met my husband, though, right when I was like, it had been a year, and everyone's like, you need to start dating. And I was like, oh, but dating, I'd never dated, I'd been single in LA, really. So it's very different from, when I was, in my 20s and dating in New York City, because you would go to bars and you would hang out at restaurants of like within like your crowd people. But here in LA, it's so spread out. Bars seemed like more like 20 something, and everyone hung out in their houses. So I was like, I don't know how you meet people. So everyone's like, you have to online date. And I was like, oh, I don't want to. And finally I started online dating. I think I did 11 dates in a month.
Wow.
and then I met my husband.
Wow.
On a book tour. Yeah. So,
but not online dating.
Not online dating. Yeah.
Because you said you meant.
Yeah.
Wow. So it's like meant to be.
Yeah. Meant to be, for sure.
Came at the right time.
Yeah.
You mentioned also in this letter, which, by the way, I think should be at the front of your book. Why is it in the back? It's like the back. I thought it was so interesting. It like informed my whole reading, but it was like after the fact. You said when you had left your first husband, your mom was not so happy about that.
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk about that.
Okay. I'll tell you anything. Having been raised in a very traditional Korean household here in the United States, my parents were extremely strict. I hear that like almost parents, like Korean parents who like immigrated to the United States were almost even more strict than like Korean parents were at the time in Korea, basically, because they were just so, bent on like, you have to be a certain way and like, all the studying and the education, etc. So my mom really was a traditional like at home house, mother and like housewife. And she really, I do honestly think believes that like women are kind of to cater to men. Like, that's just how I was raised always. And so I was always told, like, you laugh too loud, you talk too much, like, no man's going to want you, or you have champagne taste. Like, in my 20s, my mom was like, no one's ever going to marry you. It was just like this, like, continual, like, struggle between us. So when I finally did marry, he wasn't Korean, but he was a doctor, and she, like, loved him and thought he was, like, I think she was surprised that I managed to land him. So when, after 5 years of marriage, I wasn't happy anymore, and I was really thinking about considering divorce and leaving him, we had one of our biggest fights ever. She was just like, and I was like, would you rather I'm unhappy and married, miserable, or would you rather I was happy and divorced? And she's like, I would rather you stay married. And I was like, all right, well, I don't think we have anything more to talk about.
It's hard to go against that.
Yeah.
Right?
It was very hard to go against it. Luckily, I had a cell phone. I didn't tell her. I left and moved back to New York. I didn't tell her for 6 months.
No.
She didn't know you have a cell phone. She can call. I mean, if she calls me and I just was like, oh, he's busy or he's at work. I just didn't tell her. We weren't talking as often anymore because I was mad at her as well. That was like that was a very big moment between me and my mom of like, this is my life. This is like, I have to like service like my own happiness. I'm not living for you or what you want from me. I'm sorry. You got the nice, fancy Vera Wang wedding, that you got to throw me. And so that was for you. But now it's my time.
You need to write about that.
Yeah.
I mean, let's write that book. Come on.
Right, exactly.
Like, I want to read about that. That's perfect. I did now what, by the way, and I know I mentioned this too offline, but came for me at like the perfect time in my life when I was getting married. And so it's just like so perfect, like full circle that now we're here and we're talking about our second marriages, and like it's just so funny.
I know when I received the questions and I saw that you had read my first book, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like kismet. It's meant to be.
Yeah, it's so crazy. I mean, it's like I remember reading that book. But anyway, so cool. So part of Anna Kay's whole thing is this posh lifestyle, and you include so many references to brands and items, and you just set that scene so well. Like everything is in the moment. You just so nailed it, basically.
Thank you.
So talk to me about that decision to use so many brands and timely references and like just root it so specifically in that time and place.
I think, in the original, it was very much a piece about like society and like your place in society. So to me, I always wanted it to be like a soapy, fun read. So I wanted it to have this aspirational, I love Gossip Girl, the show as well. And I just wanted to have that sort of quality of like, ooh, the lives of these people and like the pressures that you face. In terms of the brands and the designers, I've been thinking about that, like why I was so specific. And I was like, oh, I wonder if some of it came from like, I was a huge fan of Jay McInerney and Bret Easton Ellis, like their first books. And like they label drop a lot. But what's interesting, in the very beginning of the book, I made a conscious effort to probably do it even more so. Because I feel like when you see these wealthy kids, you really look at, when you first meet anyone, you look at the outside and their superficial materialistic appearance, like their shoes they're wearing and this and that. But I slowly, as you go through the book, started to drop out the designer labels and stuff as you got to know the characters. Because I wanted it to be like, oh, when you first meet them, you think they're rich and perfect and have these wonderful lives because they're rich, but it's really not the truth. Like until you get to know a person, then you can kind of drill down and realize that they have the same sort of teenage issues that every teenager faces. Under a different magnifying glass and with different pressures. So it was important to me. I went to 1 year of boarding school at St. George's in Newport, Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. So got to see a lot of the teenagers that were probably in that wealth class of the characters of Anna Kay. I myself was not actually in that class, but it was interesting. And what I took away from that was like, oh, we're still talking about boys. We're still talking about the zits that we have. We're still talking about we have the same issues. So teenagers who were born into wealth, to me, that's just, they were born. It's not like that's everything who they are. They were born that way, basically. And so I just found it sometimes you wonder if the people give them a hard time just because, there is, one of your questions was this idea of wealth in today. It's not that popular to be rich. But I was like, yeah, but for teenagers, they get a free pass. I feel like all teens get a free pass. They were born into their circumstances. So who they become and the choices they make as a teenager, wealthy or not wealthy, is going to define them for their lives. So I definitely wanted it, was commenting on that, but not really about the class system.
So when does the free pass expire? At what age, do you not get the pass anymore?
I always tell, my husband has a little sister who's 29, and I'm like, really? I feel like your 20s when they're so smart and driven and serious. And I was like, you know what? You're kind of, to me, your 20s are your chance to screw up and do whatever you want to do. I made so many mistakes when I thought I was so worldly and knew everything in my 20s. And every decade you're like, oh, wow, I didn't know anything back then. So, I feel like you get a free pass for a long time.
Okay.
With love, especially with love, I think you definitely, it's tricky. Love and relationships.
I feel though that, not to say you're not giving them a free pass, but I feel like there's a poking fun at this whole lifestyle in the book. You know what I mean? You're not mean about it,
right? But
it's definitely not exploitation, a expose of a certain class of kids.
Yeah, I wanted to comment a little bit about it. And I really wanted, there's a Dustin character who's Levin from the original, and he's really an outsider status where he is Black, adopted, but raised by Jewish white parents. And he's probably the one who's the smartest in the moral center, where I gave him the freedom to comment on it, because I feel like you need to be able to have a voice in the book to say, it's crazy the way you live. But I feel like if you're a teen and you were raised that way, do you know it's crazy? Because that's kind of the world that it can be very a sheltered existence. We're there at country clubs with other people who are of their same, wealth level. Do they know it's that? It's all about perspective. I feel like when you're a teenager, until you meet people from different backgrounds, you don't necessarily know that your upbringing was that different, do you?
No.
Right, exactly. Right.
You know what I mean? No, yes, but I went to one of these schools. Right. I went to two of them. Right. Anyway, this is not so far. These were not. I'm not going to get into this.
No, but
I'm going to leave myself out of this. I think parts of it seem realistic, but these were not my people.
Right.
I wasn't in I didn't run like this.
With the fast crowd.
I was more, but anyway. Moving on. There was this part about Dustin, though, that he's just wow, look at how things work in the world. I didn't even know, right? And he was resistant about even going into this class of people, this whole situation. He was recruited to be a tutor for his friend when he was younger. And then he gets to see, goes to a party in the beginning and is looking all around wow, maybe I should enjoy it because maybe I'm not going to get back here again.
Right.
So there is also that part of it. And I feel like there's something to this book where you're well, I have to keep, right? I might not get back in this again. Let me see what happens in this.
I think there's just when I went to New York City at 18 for college at NYU. And I grown up in Tennessee, a small town Tennessee. So New York City was the biggest change possible. So there, when you see how grand everything is, and then you realize how much money there is in New York City, you can't help, especially teenager through your 20s, fantasizing and being oh, I wonder what, there's a whole other part of the city that's going on around you that's wealth and connections and fancy things. And you just always kind of fantasize that about it. Because I was broke through most of my 20s, so working in book publishing. And so you just kind of are so interested. So to me, it was I just really wanted to show this soapy hidden world of where to them, getting your first designer thing. It's just that's just their lives. They woke, their closet is filled with designer bags, where for me, I was begging my mom through my entire 20s to like get my first Prada purse. I was like, please. My mom would be like, it's more than your rent. And I'm like, I know, but if you want me to find a husband, that's what
FYI, I did not grow up with my closet full of designer purses. Just saying that was not my experience in the slightest. But anyway, that's so funny. So you're turning this into now a series with HBO Max. Tell me about how that's going.
We're still in the waiting process. TV development's so much is a longer timeline, basically. I mean, it's funny because I feel like I just read Deadline and you see like show after show after show, and there's so many. But like behind the scenes, like the development process, because there's so many stages of it, it's taking a while. So I just don't have that much information about it yet. When I sold the book, I was lucky enough to have like my first Hollywood like bidding war for the studio side, and then on the network side we pitched it, and there was like a lot of interest, and it was really fun. But what was great is having been working in TV for like the last 10 years, I sort of like understood like the game at that point in time. So none of it went to my head, but I got sent a bottle of vintage Cristal and Sprinkles cookies, and I was like, this is crazy, like what's happening now. Like I'm living this like sort of Hollywood fantasy, but at the same time, since I've been here, I didn't take it too seriously and I just had fun with it.
So you're saying during which stage were you getting the Cristal? This is once you had...
When there was like a lot of different producers. I met with 14 different producers, and like I think there were 25 that wanted to meet. As soon as like the book got announced, it just was like a feeding frenzy. And so I spent 3 weeks meeting different production companies and talking to them about like, you know, what their ideas were. And I could always tell, like, that in Hollywood, a lot of the assistants read the books, basically, for their bosses. Because a lot of the assistants were always like, when they greeted me, they're like, oh my God, I love the book and this and that. And then they probably wrote coverage. But I could tell in the meeting which producers had read the book themselves based on the conversation. So it was and I really took my time and was very careful with this process, because it's obviously, you know, this is the dream TV show for me to do, because I'm an executive producer, I'm writing it, you know, I'm the creator of the show. So I really wanted to like make very sound, smart decisions.
So how did you pick your final producer?
You know, it's interesting. I met with like when it was narrowed down to like the last group of 4 and they were connected with different studios, you know, that they were all sort of vying for it. I really was like looking for people. I'm like, oh, I'm going to have to work with them. A TV show could last for knock on wood, like 4 or 5 years. I'm like, I'm going to have to be with these people all the time. I need to like make sure I like them. I have a very strict no asshole policy.
Nice. Love it.
That I don't work with, you know, people that I know are going to be jerks about something. So I was very careful about that. I tend to like strong females, you know, working with them as well. And one of my executive producers is James Shin at the Scooter Braun production company. And James is Korean. And I wasn't necessarily making that as a conscious choice, but I found that very helpful in our discussion. Because obviously Jenny Han, To All the Boys I've Loved, I read this article about her when she was deciding who was going to get the movie, the producers. She picked the one producers who said that they would make sure that the girl stayed Korean or half Korean. And I was like, oh, I really respected that, because she was already a New York Times bestseller. So she had her choice, basically. And for once, I had my choice. I've honestly never been in this position before in Hollywood where I was the one who had like the power and ability to choose. So it was important for me to make sure like I had the right people. And I did like that James, you know, he talked to me a lot about like his own childhood and violin lessons and his own Korean upbringing. So I felt like that was like a good, you know, fit for me and the book.
So cool.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, while you have all this going on,
right,
what are you doing now? Are you working on a new show? Are you writing a new book? Are you thinking about a next book? Are you thinking about only saving your creative power for the adaptation?
It's so funny. Like I'm always like, everyone always has that side hustle going. So for a long time, as when I came out here and I had been writing books, but wasn't making enough of a living doing that. And then I was like, I need to concentrate on one thing. Cause I'm like, I want to write a play. I want to write short stories. I mean, like, I'm so like, it's not flighty, but I'm
creative.
Creative and curious and want to try so many different things. But I was like, I need to focus on TV will be my day job, and then books will be on the side. But now it's kind of flip-flopping again. I have a couple TV projects like that are, you know, I'm really working to try to create and have my own show get greenlit so that I can run it. So I have like a kid's show at Netflix that's in contention. I have the Anna Kay project, which is obviously the dream project. I have a Korean soap opera with Margaret Cho.
Ooh.
that adapting a Korean soap. So that's super fun. That's a comedy. I am writing another book, and I am writing a sequel.
No way.
Yes.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That is so cool. And when I was reading this book, I was like, wow, this could be like multiple books.
Right.
Like there's so much going on in here.
Right.
Like, and so many characters. This is amazing.
I know. I really wanted, at first, I mean, this really was supposed to be a one-off. It was no intention to like do a series. But then once the TV show sold, I was like, oh, the TV show, the first season would be the first book. Mm-hmm. So I was like, oh, if I could write the books per season.
Perfect.
And you would see it. So the second book takes place over the summer. So I was like, oh, because to me, I feel like as a teenager, your lives is your school year versus your summer. And I'm like, who doesn't want to see a bunch of rich kids and how they party in the summer?
So is this the Hamptons, Anna K. Hamptons version?
Partially. Like, there's going to be some of the characters. I'm going to have a character, Beatrice, is going to come to LA.
Okay.
She's doing an internship. So some will be in New York, but some are traveling abroad. So I really wanted to make it,
so cool.
Very expensive. Yeah. I'm working on it right now. Literally, as soon as after I'm going to go home and continue writing when I get home.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
I love it. Do you have any advice for aspiring authors?
Let's see. I have always wanted to write, and I just really think that you have to. My best success have come from things that are like personal to me, because sometimes I'm like, oh, as a fiction writer, you're like, I have an imagination. Why can't I just create things that are totally fictionalized and just like make it up from my head? Like that's how I used to think. And then I was like, oh, but to have an emotional impact and weight, I was like, my best success have always been things that I wrote about personally. Like my first book was about my first year of marriage and me kind of struggling with that and trying to figure it out. My second book was about how to tell if you're obsessed with your dog, because I was currently obsessed with my dog. So I think that's where I get the most creative inspiration from. And it's just like that. So, when you're thinking about like what you want to write, I think you try every genre and, stage versus TV versus a book and just see where it takes you, really. And also you have to sometimes put your butt in the chair and just write, because that's what I did with that kids book I told you about, where I was getting up early before work. I was like, I want to try. And I set these small goals. I'm like 10 pages. I didn't always hit 10 pages every morning, but that was my goal. I had a friend that I would email the 10 pages to keep me on track, even though I wasn't asking her to read it. It was just so I had it so that I could kind of, keep myself accountable, because it's hard. It's busy. Life is busy.
I'm so interested in seeing what you write today after this.
Yeah.
I want you to send me like a paragraph.
All right, I will.
I'm like totally fascinated.
Yes,
Plus, I want
will.
more of all of these people.
Right.
Like, tell me more. Anyway. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And sorry again for my appearance today. And thank you. I cannot wait to see what happens.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a fun talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. You've been listening to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books with Zibby Owens. Please make sure to sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com to get more updates about episodes like these and also lots of live events. Thanks to Lauren Passell and her innovative PR company, Tink, for sponsoring today's episode. Please check them out at tinkmedia.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music. Thanks for listening. You could always email me at zibby@zibbyowens.com.